Okay, great. So, hi everyone, my name is Anya McNicholas and I am a co-editor of the Clinical Psychology Today journal and your host for the Summer 2022 Clinical Psychology Today podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my two guests, Tony O'Reilly, a gambling addiction counsellor, and Professor Colin O'Gara, consultant psychiatrist, head of addiction services at St. John of God Hospital and clinical professor at UCD. We are also going to be speaking to two published authors. So Tony with Declan Lynch wrote the book Tony 10, which is about Tony's personal experience with gambling addiction. Meanwhile, Colin has written the book Gambling Addiction in Ireland: Causes, Consequences and Recovery, which aims to help patients and family members struggling with gambling addiction. So you're both very welcome. Thank you for being here today to talk with me about gambling addiction. So we're going to jump straight in, and Colin, if I could turn to you first. So gambling addiction, defined as the persistent and recurrent problematic gambling behaviour leading to clinically significant impairment or distress, has been placed in a new category of behavioural addictions in the DSM-5. What are the symptoms required for a diagnosis of gambling disorder?
So the symptoms are similar to any other addiction in terms of you have persistence with gambling in the face of adverse consequences. That's the key issue. You have, after initial exposure to behavior of gambling, in this case, you get increasing tolerance, so you do need to gamble more to have the same desired effect. One of the key differences is the chasing of losses, which would be different to, say, other addictions, and there is that financial piece. The symptoms would be like destruction, decline of other activities, relationship difficulties, which would mimic then drug and alcohol. So a lot of the generic features of addiction, but then you have the other specifier of having, chasing losses and the financial piece, which all would have been under review at the time in 2013 with DSM-5 when they were looking at forming those criteria.
Okay, and let's talk now about causation. So is there a gene-environmental interaction at play?
Well, I guess that's debatable. My own view is, there's certainly clear genetic factors, so heritability coefficient, which from twin studies, which would be the amount of genetic influence, say, in the overall phenotype. Studies would have, they vary quite widely from 0, maybe up to 70%. Typically in addiction, studies would fall in around 50% for the heritability coefficient. So that's the genetic piece. In terms of environment, I think around adolescence, would generally be thought to be a time where environmental influences are higher than maybe later on in life. So the gene environment interaction is one which I think, if you believe genetics are present and environmental factors are present, well, then you'll probably agree that there's a gene environment interaction. The most obvious, we see it obviously in the case of modeling, be it between siblings or parents or within the peer group. So environment, from that point of view is important. It's also very important with regards to the structural environment, so betting shops in the high street or access to mobile phones, and we would have seen that in the last 10 years, that environmental influence. So if you put together, we see in the clinic every day, if you put together the gene and you'll have a family history, and then people will recount their environmental influences. It would only be logical that those two would interact then, yes.
Okay, and what does research tell us about reward processing and dopamine dysregulation in pathological gamblers?
the biological basis of addiction is gambling addiction is a very clear example of how one could make a very strong case for the biological basis of addiction, because in Parkinson's disease we see disorder in many areas of the brain, but specifically similar regions to, say, the orbitofrontal cortices. So we see dopamine dysregulation in Parkinson's. We see that's part of the disease. So pathological gambling is higher. The prevalence would be, say, 3% up to 6% in Parkinson's disease. And then if you put somebody on a drug that tries to increase the levels of dopamine in the brain, called a dopamine agonist, you get higher levels again of pathological gambling. So it goes up as high as, in some studies, 15% in Parkinson's disease cohorts where you have prescribed, where a dopamine agonist has been prescribed. So, gambling addiction, and it's not really well known, I suppose, from it's not put out there, I mean, in arguments about the biological base of addiction in general, but increasingly so. I think there's an appreciation, as process addictions themselves, say gambling, video gaming, sex addiction, even exercise. People are starting to see that process addictions are now very serious, and clinically we're starting to treat more and more process addictions. But I think gambling addiction, from the point of view, it's a crossover with neurology and neurology clinics. It's a real example of where there's a crossover into medicine, an example of the biological basis.
Okay, thank you. Tony, if I could turn to you now. As a gambling addiction counsellor, what are the therapeutic models central to your work?
I suppose primarily it would be CBT, because the research would show that CBT works well with gambling. I would always work from a person-centered point of view, because, again, we might touch on it later on, but a lot of people who experience gambling addiction, not a whole lot of people will present for help. And I suppose it's important to make them feel comfortable and make them feel accepted in the room, because, again, we'll be touching on the stigma of it later on. A lot of time that's really a block for people to look for that help and support. So I would use some motivational interviewing techniques as well. And then usually it's a shorter piece of work because of our limitations in our organisation with sessions and funding. But if you do a longer piece of work, it definitely will be trauma informed, looking at areas of childhood trauma with attachments, and a lot of time with gambling as well. You're looking at working with issues such as anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, self-worth, self-confidence. So that's primarily the kind of approach which I would use with gambling addiction.
Okay, and how has your own experience of gambling addiction informed your work as a counsellor?
I suppose because I work primarily in the area of gambling addiction, because I went through my own gambling addiction, I work predominantly in that area. I would work with addiction in general, but I suppose I try to specialise in gambling addiction because it's the area that I'm most passionate about. And I suppose it's my own experience of going in for treatment. It was when I arrived in the treatment centre. I felt that there was, again, it was 11 years ago, there wasn't as much information out there. There wasn't as much research as there is now. Again, it was 2 years before it was put into the DSM-5. So I felt that for my work as a counsellor, I had to be empathic towards the people who came through the doors to see us, where that isn't all, that in my experience of working with people, their experience isn't always that. So when I was in the treatment centre, I did feel that, the person-centred approach, non-judgmental, and that really helped me in recovery, the feeling of I was understood or not judged for the gambling, because I'd done enough of that myself for 11 years in addiction. I judged myself and kind of nearly called myself out as an idiot. Why couldn't I stop? And I think when I experienced that, that really laid the foundations for how I predominantly work as a gambling addiction counsellor, to make sure that the person isn't judged or is met of where they are at in their recovery journey as well.
Right. Okay. And you advocate for the importance of harm minimization and education. So I'm interested to know, how have you incorporated these into your work?
I suppose with the educational piece, when we're doing talks within the schools or different organisations, I would share my lived experience of my gambling addiction as part of a kind of a hard-hitting story of what can happen. And the bigger piece of those workshops is a psychoeducational piece. So even when I'm working with people who present with gambling problems, you're looking at doing a psychoeducational piece with them as well to kind of explain, things like game design, like the reward systems, like conditioning of gambling, so that people understand or have an idea of where this might be coming from, as well as their own personal underlying issues, just to give a real broad understanding around the gambling part of it as well. So I think the psychoeducational piece, there's definitely a crossover, and I would use my work or some examples I might get from my work in the sessions, and also vice versa. So definitely the psychoeducational piece is definitely a bit that I would bring into my work that would definitely be a crossover between my two areas of work.
Okay, that's really interesting. Colin, I might come back to you now. I want to ask you, in the clinic, what do you see in terms of comorbidity in patients with gambling disorder?
Main comorbidity would be alcohol, but really clinically, in young people, you're really dealing with, probably young men, you're dealing with a cohort of individuals who, you're really open to the spectrum of, drug use, alcohol use, and maybe other process addictions. But, certainly in frequency, you're talking alcohol, again, maybe some cannabis, maybe stimulant use. It's whatever is prevalent in the country at the time. Obviously, we have a stimulant problem at the moment in terms of cocaine. So it wouldn't be unusual for pub going young men in Ireland to be, within the pub drinking, binge drinking, using stimulants in the form of cocaine and going in and out of the bookies. Also, young men on their phones, sports betting, maybe away from the pub situation. They may be into sports, into keeping fit. And there may be occasional stimulant use, but not particularly the alcohol piece because of its effect on sporting performance. In females, you'd see crossover with gaming and internet gaming issues, maybe not internet gaming disorder. So really, it's across the spectrum, but the most common has to be alcohol.
Okay. And what about conditions such as depression or anxiety, bipolar? Would you see any of those?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I focused on other addictions there, but yeah. I mean, there's a whole spectrum then of mental health difficulty. So, I suppose it depends on the severity of gambling disorder. In the latter stages or more severe gambling disorder,
Okay.
Pain with food disorder, and unfortunately, a lot of the studies focus on the prevalence of suicidal thoughts.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last sentence there, Colin.
Sorry, just the prevalence of suicidal thoughts within affective disorders, so depression and that. So that's a serious problem that we come across. And then from the mental health point of view, neurotic spectrum disorders as well, such as anxiety, any of the anxiety spectrum problems as well, we would see commonly. Bipolar, not so much. Bipolar is an exclusionary factor. So if somebody's manic, they would have a primary diagnosis of mania, and that would be excluded because overspending obviously would be part of bipolar affective disorder. And until such time the bipolar affective disorder is treated, and has resolved, you couldn't really make a diagnosis of gambling disorder in that situation.
Okay. And when a person with gambling disorder is attending your clinic, what are the biological, psychological, and social treatment interventions that you can offer them?
Okay, so from a biological point of view, you're looking at the spectrum of medication. So we just talked about from a psychiatric point of view, it's not uncommon that we would be using either antidepressant, mood stabilizers, or antipsychotic medication. So it goes across the full spectrum in terms of looking at somebody's comorbidity. A drug, an opioid blocker like naltrexone as well, although not licensed for treatment in gambling disorder, is very commonly used across process addiction and can be helpful. Very simple well-being issues like come in under biological, like nutrition. I mean, a lot of people who present for gambling disorder treatment haven't eaten in days, if not weeks, and it's hard, I suppose, to kind of work out why that is. But ultimately, it comes down to access to funds. And if somebody is very, very unwell with compulsivity, we often will see money. People will not be eating the way they should. So simple stuff around diet, nutrition, and if people do manage to get admitted to the inpatient setting, there may be an element of weight loss. And people are very embarrassed as well to admit that they hadn't been eating properly, so that part as well. Psychological, Tony referred there to we'll be looking at CBT and motivational approaches. So like Tony said, concur with it in terms of, I'm here in the program and going into almost year 16 now, and you learn fairly quickly on you're looking after a program or heading up a program that confrontational methods don't work, so you're going to do non-confrontational approach as well, that you can't be your own discipline. That's the solution. It has to be multifactorial approach. So we have Tai Chi, mindfulness, mindful body work, Aikido therapy, Pilates, yoga, all part of our program, as well as physical therapy, gym and various sports, So sometimes people look at those inputs and think, they're soft inputs and they're not particularly important. Very, very important part of the program, and it's also a message that you're caring for them, and you're treating the same as if you went off somewhere else to do something else that you'd have, say, if you stayed somewhere for a period of time. We're not, again, we're not trying to be a hotel, but if you, with respect, and you'd put on proper classes in the, for instance. So that's important. The motivation interviewing, obviously, there's very strong literature on that, and it's a very well developed way of trying to encourage people to get well without being confrontational, basically. And then finally, on the social piece, we would generally look at the input of groups, linking people in with, say, Smart Recovery, GA, Life Ring, that's another generic group. So any of the groups, hobbies, interests, family inputs, so social work is very big there. So really, I could go on, but they're the kind of the headlines,
Okay, so it's a very holistic approach.
Yeah, across the board. So trying to hit all the different one area of work, and I'm sure Tony would be happy to hear that I'm not kind of espousing one area, because Tony would know well that that's not how it works. That you do, like, some people might respond, for instance, to a biological. They might respond well to med. Other people might do really well, say, on a particular therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy is the other one that's kind of a third generation, as it's called. So it's a blend of mindfulness and CPT. But that, they might respond very well to that, or they might have a family as well. But at the end of the day, people should be offered everything, really, and the broader the base of the input, the better the outcome. That's really the motto,
Okay. Great. So Tony, I might come back to you. What are the primary misconceptions people have about gambling addiction?
Well, the biggest one is that it's just a financial problem. I think even like as a society, I think it's still seen as just a bit of a bet. I suppose when people present for help and support, I suppose it's like gambling's an easy way to make money. My gambling is under control. I know I have some of them just from we work off a worksheet for our CPT work with on some certain sessions, and these are just some of the things that would come up. I can stop anytime. Sometimes I think I have two personalities. Gambling makes me feel better. The big one is gambling will be the solution to my problems. So I think with people when they look at gambling addiction, there is misconceptions around it that it's not as bad as alcohol addiction or bad as drug addiction. It's just it's, as I think Colin referred to, it's just willpower. You should be able to stop. Why can't you stop? And it's not as simple as that, as we know from any process addiction. Like, I would challenge anyone who may be listening to lock away their mobile phone for 2 weeks and see how they feel without having the access to their mobile phone. They'll nearly feel like I've often heard people saying I'd nearly rather break my arm than lose my phone, because we're so connected to our mobile phones. The thought of being away with it, and it's the same with gambling as well. It's not just willpower. It's that it is a full blown addiction, as Colin has described brilliantly there. So I think it's that kind of idea that maybe it's not as serious as it is, or it's just a bit of crack. And we would have that in Ireland. That's a kind of sometimes a societal thing as well, that it's only a bet. And that's where we need to change people's perceptions of it as well. And I remember when I went into treatment in 2011, and there was no books on the subject. I remember running around looking for Oisin McConville's book, The Gambler, thinking it'd have all the answers, because there wasn't as much written about it. Now, thankfully, since it was introduced into the DSM-5, there's been a load of research done on it, and Colin himself has done a lot of research on the area as well. And that creates conversations that can change attitudes towards it. So I think the attitudes are starting to change, and the misconceptions are starting to change, and that's due to all the really good research that's been done. But as we'll probably discuss later on again, a lot more needs to be done in around research as well.
Okay. And what is the role of stigma in gambling addiction?
Huge role. I think even if you look at the safer gambling messages that are on our televisions each night, it's like take time to think. When the fun stop. It puts all the onus on the individual to take responsibility in that moment. So that kind of, when people are falling into that, further down that gambling spectrum and getting to the stage of being disordered, it's literally like, I can't go for help because it's packaged up as this entertainment, and I shouldn't have a problem with it. And I think, like, if you look at 1 to 2% of people who actually access our website, which would be a lot of traffic on the website, only 1 to 2% of people will actually make contact. So there's still a lot of stigma around it. And we need to change that messaging that's out there. We need a public health approach to it. Any of the ads that are on TV, and there are hundreds of ads on TV, even the ones for safer gambling, are very jazzy. It's all people having fun, and it's just kind of, at the end of it, there's a gambling message, set your limits.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm in the middle of a gambling addiction, I'm not in control, so I can't take a step back and set my limits. And a lot of times, as Colin was saying about chasing those losses at that stage, you don't want to admit that you have a problem because you really feel you can gamble your way out of it. You have all the examples. If you've had a big win before, you think, well, all I need to do is this next big win. I think we would all agree that you can't drink your way out of an alcohol problem or drug your way out of a drug problem, but the gambler believes, I'm just that one bet away. And that creates that kind of adds to the stigma of, I remember, fear, ego, and pride stopped me looking for help. Fear of what will happen if I bring this to, because it wasn't talked about. It's not in any of the policies within companies. You'd have a drug and alcohol policy. You very rarely have a gambling policy. So I was working in finance. So if I go to my employer and say, well, I have a gambling problem, I feel my job is gone. Or if I go to my family and say I'm after gambling away the savings, I feel like my marriage is gone. So it's that fear. And I think the societal stigma definitely adds to that as well, because it's as I said in the last kind of answer, it's just a bit of crack. And how could I have a problem with this? And that's the biggest part of the work you do with people, is that accepting that this is a problem, or it's the first step in the fellowship meetings, accepting that you have a problem or that's unmanageable. And it's that thing of, I wouldn't say so much with alcohol, but definitely with alcohol, maybe back in the day, or smoking back in the day, it's not seen as a big problem. but I think we need to change that attitude in society, because there's definitely a stigma out there about it. Like, it's packaged up as entertainment, and if I went for a nice meal with my partner or went to the cinema, I wouldn't ask for my money back on the way out. But with gambling, there's an expectation that you're going to win your money back, or that you're due to win your money back. So if it is packaged up as an entertainment thing, people don't look at it as that. They look at it as a way to make money. So again, that's another thing that we need to really. That's why we need to be having these conversations around gambling, saying yes, for the majority it is something that's entertainment, but and I will say this, an ever increasing amount of people, it is becoming a problem. I suppose we just need to change attitudes.
Yeah.
I noticed you nodding your head there, Colin, to what Tony was saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's Tony is obviously on the cold face, and that central thing about trying to gambling problem. That's it in a nutshell, really. I mean, the people. We have such a strong financial backing of the industry have so much funds really to put out a particular message, and we're in a situation where that message is always being put out. But I think with regard to the new legislation that's going to be coming on spring, the stigma that Tony talks about. I mean, it's there's two pieces to it. One, people are addressing gambling as a means of improving their finances, and two, when you do run into difficulty, nobody really wants to know, and that's really it in essence. And so, how do you construct help for people? There'll be very extensive legislation published. It'll all be complicated, and there'll be focus on casinos and slots and this, that, and that, and the other. I mean, it's at the end of the day, I worry that we'll get lost. The central messages will get lost in that, and I think stigma and the core issue in gambling, which is that you have people who, in a lot of cases, are deprived in some way. They don't have much finances, and they're using this behavior as a way of improving their situation, their family situation. Hence, bookies are located in, map bookies, they're located in deprived areas. They're located alongside chippers and pubs and cash cash exchange facilities, and so it's very sad. I mean, the whole gambling piece is it is about deprivation, and getting it right is about it's about social justice, and it's about doing the right thing for in the face of, it's a real David and Goliath situation where we're there's Tony, myself, and a number of other people we probably feel like we're very quiet voices in the face of a megaphone style noise coming the opposite direction, and that's really the crux of it. I mean, how do we? I mean, my most recent submission to an Oireachtas committee was trying to encapsulate that whatever we do from here on, we're about 15-20 years behind the curve, and gambling is a massive problem in Ireland now. I mean, Tony alluded to the fact that many people who suffer from this condition don't come for treatment, which is an additional problem. I mean, most of what we see here in this clinic, and this is a generic addiction clinic, is alcohol. We don't see people with gambling addiction because, for whatever reason, they don't get to treatment. So we do have a massive issue, and Tony's point about it really could sum up this whole podcast. Really, it's just the issue of people gambling to improve, on a belief that they're going to improve their finances, and then after that, being afraid to raise the problem, I think sums up gambling. Those two things sum up the whole gambling disorder area. Those two things, that's what it's about. And to understand gambling disorder as opposed to other addictions like drug and alcohol, you know, it's so bad and it's so toxic. You know, it's such a toxic thing to be suffering from, that people can't even say to their loved ones. They keep it from their loved ones for so long that it breaks so late. So, you know, this is what we're facing, an uphill battle really now. I haven't spoken to Tony recently about the delays in the legislation, but like, it's every week that goes by, it's going to be more and more and more difficult. You know, the task becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. Anyway, I don't want to get too negative on you, Anya. This hopefully isn't that wasn't the intention of putting myself and Tony together today, that it would get too negative. But no, I think that message is very important, and I'm delighted that Tony got those points out. So that's why I was nodding my head.
Okay, very good. No, it's massively insightful, and I think this will be of great interest to our audience here at Clinical Psychology today. I'd like to pose the following questions to both of you, and I know that you both touched on a little bit the following. I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the rapid development and widespread advertising of online gambling and gambling apps in recent years?
I'll maybe jump in quickly. I suppose it's one sentence. It's at saturation point. It really is. It's absolutely, you're being bombarded. I remember even you know, because I talk about gambling a lot, or because I'm working, I'm on the laptop research and stuff. If I go online, I'm being bombarded with gambling ads. So I remember one day it came up in some ad. There was an ad either side of the screen, and I clicked X on the ad and blocked it, and then as soon as I done that, the other one popped up. I went over to that side. It was like whack-a-mole. I went over to that side and pressed the X, and then this one popped up and I went over. So I think, you know, if you look at gambling within sport, on our tellies, you know, it's well documented that a lot of Premier League football teams are sponsored by gambling companies or have gambling partners. I was watching the Ludogorets Shamrock Rovers match last night, and two betting companies and betting hoarding all around the stadium, and so you couldn't get away. Like, when I turned it on, the first thing that hit me was FBet or eBet or FBet, and it's in our face, and it's all about brand awareness, brand recognition. Like, you know, my 10-year or 11-year-old daughter, now she was 10 at the time, turned around and said, oh, that's the new Paddy Power ad. She shouldn't know what Paddy Power is. Now, she probably will in a few years when I'm telling her my story, but she shouldn't know what Paddy Power is. And that's because ads are on during the day, they're on between sports events. And it's like, even during the Euros, or it was the Euros last year, or 2 years ago, the football, it was every single ad between the matches were gambling. And if I look back at when I was 10 or 11, you know, the shirts, like, you know, you had Liverpool at Crown Paints and you had Man United at Sharp and Arsenal at JVC. I still remember those. Like, I still remember them really, really well. And you start kind of associating that these are good products, or they're safe products, or so that's why you would buy. Like, you know, if I was, you know, Sharp would have been very big back then, I suppose, as electronics. You don't see as much nowadays, but I think that kind of brand awareness for younger people is dangerous. I think that on social media, if you scroll down, like even on Facebook or any of these social media, TikToks as well, I'm not up on a lot of the new ones, but there's gambling ads, and then you have social media influencers who are actually streaming themselves playing video games, losing thousands or winning thousands, which gives a skewed view of what gambling is to our younger people. And the advertisement bit is really something we need to look at for the younger generations, because it is normalizing it even more than it already is. So as Colin was saying, we're 15, 20 years behind the curve, but there's a whole generation now of gamblers or potential gamblers coming up, because there's such a link or a crossover between gaming and gambling. The graphics are the same. You know, games like Grand Theft Auto actually has a casino in it, where you can play virtually the same type of casino that you can play online. Now, the only difference is you can't take money back out. That's the loophole. But it normalizes it. And that game has 70 million people bought it, 50 million people play it online, and if even a small percentage of that is children playing it online, it's normalising it going forward. So from that point of view, it's absolutely, to go back to my original thing, we're at saturation point with it.
Wow, okay. And what has been the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on gambling addiction in Ireland?
It's to me, is it, Anya?
Whoever wants to take that question.
Sorry. Well, I presume it's to say I was actually asking Tony and Barry, his colleague Barry Grant, for info. I think, Tony, you if you want to talk maybe about your contacts with your service, that data is probably good, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose we did see, we definitely saw a rise of the amount of people contacting the service. But the big thing that really hit me as well is that people were developing the problem a lot quicker. So my slide along the gambling continuum was probably over 10 years. Going from regular gambler to heavy gambler, problematic, to disordered gambler. What we're seeing now in some cases is that definitely there's a younger cohort of people looking for help and support, but they're getting to trouble a lot quicker. So it might be that they're after developing a problem very, very quickly. So it could be 6 months they're actually at the disorder stage, or hitting all the criteria for that. And there's kind of reasons behind that. I suppose we were all driven more back online because of COVID. We're spending more times at our laptops or at our phones. There was less things to do out in society, so we were spending a lot more time on our devices. And at the same time, the gambling industry was the one industry that grew through that time. And they spend 1.5 billion a year on marketing, as far as I know. Wow. And I think 90% of that, or I think there's a large percentage of that, maybe 80% of that is online marketing. So if we're spending more time on our devices, it's been normalized. And then if you look at anxiety, depression, people who are bored, boredom would be a big part of, if you're looking at reasons why people fall into gambling, as well as boredom is a big one, people would say. All those factors were there during COVID. And what happened was then what we're seeing is that a lot of people develop problems a lot quicker, but also there was a lot more women started accessing support as well, which is something we would normally, for every 10 people we would have work with for gambling, one would be female. So now we kind of could be 2 to 3 now. So definitely that was something we saw as well. So definitely it definitely changed. It definitely kind of speeded up a lot of people's problems, I feel, anyway.
Right. And what do you think was behind the increase in women?
I'm not sure. I think it's that kind of relief and escape gambling. Again, it could be down to people, not kind of I suppose what's the connecting with people and starting to connecting with their devices a lot more. And I think again, when those people are being targeted by the online companies as well, like 33% of online gambling has been done now, but that's an old stat, is done by women. So if we're spending more time on our devices, it would stand to reason that we're playing more, and if we play more, Colin mentioned tolerance, we have to put more money on to get to the same desired effect. So that means that we're actually there's the potential to kind of develop a problem quicker. Like I worked with a lady before, and she said that she was doing online slots, and she used to do the housework and just have her phone on auto spin. I never heard of this auto spin. And it's just spinning away in the background, and she's not even standing in front of the screen. She's just hearing if it's winning. So the noise is telling her she's winning. She's getting that dopamine hit or that. And it's just, I think for a lot of people, even myself, I got compulsions during COVID. I was on online course at night time in the US where you didn't have your camera on, you were just listening. And next thing you're checking the results of the match, and it comes into your head, geez, wouldn't it be great to have a bet? Or wouldn't it be, because it's in your face a lot more, I suppose. I think we've become more digitalized over the last couple of years. Even when I'm getting home in the evening time, my eyes are killing me from being on the screen the whole time when you're doing a lot of Zoom calls. So that's probably my experience of it. Okay.
And what needs to happen, do you think, to tackle gambling addiction in Ireland? Does it need to happen on a community, national or governmental level? And who are the stakeholders?
I think we touched on the legislation. That's the first piece.
Yeah.
Like I think Barry, my colleague, posted up just during the week there that it's 9 years since the heads of the bill were published, and the previous record for that to move through was the alcohol bill. As far as I'm aware, Barry's the self-confessed nerd of all this stuff, and I think the previous record was 3 years. So we have 9 years still waiting for this legislation to be enacted. Now, it looks like a very good piece of work, but what's the delay? It's like the white paper in the UK at the moment. There's a delay on releasing that, which could help, save hundreds of lives, if not thousands of lives. So I think the primary stakeholders would be the government, the industry, the clinicians like myself and Colin and other people who work in the area. I'm sure there's lots more. The horse racing industry. There's lots of stakeholders in it, but the big ones I think are the government and the industry to put policies and procedures in place to protect the vulnerable in society, I think.
Okay, you're nodding there, Colin. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Tony has said that really well. At the end of the day, yes, it is. It's the government's responsibility. The government of the day have responsibility to protect the citizens in terms of gambling harm. And successive governments haven't succeeded in that. As Tony alluded to, there is movement in terms of having legislation there, but really it's about enactment. And even when it is enacted, then there's a long road to travel. Setting up services, for instance, are we going to set up outpatient services, inpatient services? Are we going to have residential rehabs for people with gambling addiction? Are we going to use, if we've an accommodation crisis in the country at present, how are we going to, are we proposing to build services, or, are we going to use existing services? Are we going to piggyback on top of the community addiction teams? Who's going to, run those? Is it going to be community health organizations? Is it going to stand alongside or be within current community mental health teams or community addiction teams? All of these questions. I mean, it's going to take time, and as Tony alludes to, it's really about urgency. It's about urgency, the issue, and I think we can say for sure that there hasn't been urgency around this because most likely there's a strong lobby that affects everybody in the country. That is in politics and in business probably. But particularly politics, it's a divisive issue because there's a lot of jobs ultimately, and there's for shareholders there's a lot of money involved. So it's going to have to be government of the day who take brave decisions to make what will be unpopular decisions for some, but that's in the interest of the greater interest of public health. But Tony alluded to it a number of times that is the gambling disorder seen as a public health issue? Is it seen as a medical issue alongside a high blood pressure, diabetes, or a cancer in a general hospital? And the answer to that is no. It's fundamentally no, it isn't, and the general public will not see it as that. But it's up to us to advocate on behalf of our patients to try and get parity with physical health, right? So I go up to Vincent's, I give lectures in St. Vincent's Hospital, and this is exactly what I'm saying to the medical students up there. Do you consider gambling disorder and other addictions to be on par with, say, your attachments in surgery, medicine, obs and gynae and pediatrics? And, the answer is no, they don't. But the only way we're going to change that is a commitment from the policymakers to say that, look, there are kids dying from, there's parents bereaved here, there's kids dying, and, we have a substantial problem. And it's the work of Tony and his colleagues and, some other, people like you mentioned, Oisin McConville and many other people who've dedicated time to this to try and raise the profile of gambling disorder opposite other, because there's so many other like medical needs and other medical conditions that need a spotlight shone on it. But what I do feel is that, as Tony mentioned, saturation level, I think because of saturation level, the public now are starting to actually grasp this concept that we've been bombarded and we are at saturation point, and there's a revolt of sorts going on. And I think the longer the delay is, the longer, the closer we're getting to that point of revolt where the public will say enough is enough. Tony's point about his daughter is the same with my kids, particularly boys, when they're exposed to ads. You know, in football, they will say, you know, they obviously know that I have an interest in gambling. They probably haven't worked out you know, they don't know the complexities, you know, how nuanced that is, but they're listening to ads, and they're you know, they're commenting on the ads. But, you know, ads been on during the day, you know, pre-Watershed. You know, if you put any sport on at the weekend, or you know, anything at all, it's just as it's completely and utterly unacceptable. So it must be the public. I think if the government isn't going to do it, it'll have to be the public. But it has to, Anya, be the government. It has to be the policymakers of the day.
Just to come in quickly in the back of that as well, Anya, like any of the proposed kind of policies or things that we're asking to be put into the legislation will not impact the 95% of people who will gamble. You know, like we look at affordability checks, you look at deposit limits, or not being able to gamble on credit cards, or timeouts, whatever any of those stuff are. It won't impact the people who enjoy the bet. But what the lobbying will turn around and say, well, it's impacted everyone's experience of gambling. But the legislation and regulation and the things we put in place will protect the vulnerable, but it shouldn't have an impact on the person who's going down, putting on their lucky 15 every weekend, or put their tenner on a football accumulator. And that's where, you know, as Colin said, like there's a lot of lobbying in the background. We feel there's a lot of those stakeholders, there's money involved, and people don't want change, because there's lots of stats out there saying that the majority of the money that the industry makes comes from a smaller percentage of people, and that's the bit we need to protect, those percentages that do fall into the gambling addiction.
Right. Okay. Right. And my last question, going forward, where does the focus need to be in translational gambling addiction research to facilitate further successful outcomes in the clinic?
I put that back one on Colin, because he's done a lot of research in the area.
Well, I mean, again, simple is best. So the ultimately, I think, is epidemiology, Anya. If we start with that, you know, Tony and myself and others are always talking about stats from elsewhere. We don't have a national gambling prevalence survey.
Okay.
That we rely on, and my sense is that this idea of 0.51% of pathological gambling is nonsense. I think it's much higher. I think it's you know, there's a study in Northern Ireland recently enough which showed around 3% for that pathological gambling figure. You know, I think it's you know, 3% of the population is very high, and if you do it properly, you know, nobody wants to fill out a form, you know, particularly if they have the comorbidities we were talking about earlier, to say that they've got pathological gambling, not knowing where it would go. So I think that's number one, is to try and get an idea of prevalence. Number two, which we tried that, by the way, so we did a mini version of that, and it needed to be done on a much larger scale. Number two is service provision, which we have done as well. We've also we did a freedom of information request across CHOs across the country to look at what people are doing from a service provision. I'll summarize it in a sentence. People do their best in existing services, but ultimately anywhere there's enough service provision, not none at all. And then the next thing is around responsible gambling initiatives, which we've also done. So you need to get into online space, and you need to see what young people are doing. Not just young people, but everybody, what they're doing, what they're spending their money on. And as Tony critically alluded, I'm delighted he brought it up, because we should have a disproportionate amount of the takings from gambling turnover. So in the case of some of the UK companies, you're talking billions, of which the dividend or salary for some of the top executives can be hundreds of millions in a year. But there is a disproportionate yield in all of the gambling turnover in those situations from problem gamblers. So number 3 in research would be to drill down into that and to present that detail to the public and to the providers themselves, who may not be quite aware of where, of exactly who the money is coming from. And there are companies and there are groups and individuals who've worked in the financial sector who are now focusing on the gambling area and have the ability and have the utilities and have the technologies to do that. But obviously, you need to open up the data, or else it has to be mandated that you get access to the data, which I'm not sure about that. But I mean, ultimately, you need collaboration. But the crux, the catch-22 there is that if you do uncover that, that's going to hammer shareholder value. And obviously, that's a problem. So, but I think from a research point of view, that needs to be drilled down into, and, for everybody's benefit, so that we can move forward. Within Ireland, like what proportion of people who do have a gambling disorder are contributing to gambling company profit, and that's an important question. Another important question, but it's just an umbrella. It's just a headline for lots of work you could do within that.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it. We'll finish it there now for today. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's been massively insightful and illuminating, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Anya.
Thank you very much, Anya, and apologies for the technical